As a former international investigative journalist, I noticed the same problems across the world. And when I dug to the roots of the problems, which is what you do as an investigative journalist, I always noticed that many of them have been around for decades. Yet there seemed to be the lacking ability to transformationally change them. And so this might be obvious for climate change, about which we have been talking for decades. But it's also true for many conflicts that are ongoing, and public health challenges and so on, as we all notice in the lack of progress on all the SDGs, or Sustainable Development Goals. So to me, it seemed like we failed to imagine the world radically differently. And therefore, it seems like we're stuck in the present. And so the mission of the Summit of the Future was really to change multilateralism to become fit for the new reality and for the future. The Declaration of Future Generations in particular really aims to break open the imagination and shift from this presentism to strategic foresight. And it's with that in mind that today I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations people on whose country we are gathering today, but also First Nations people all across the world, because it seemed like they have a more holistic and interconnected worldview. They understand, live and feel that we do not live in a vacuum, but that we are part of bigger systems in time and in space, and that the past, present and future are interconnected. Yet Western societies seem to fail to acknowledge that and are stuck in presentism, which is why I like this quote of Adam Gramsci. And it's very telling for our current situation. He says, "The old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, there arises a great diversity of morbid systems." We can see this in the multilateral system failing on us. The loss of trust, credibility, and worst of all, effectiveness. And this is observable in the increased disobedience of state and non-state actors, including the perpetual conflicts and international rights abuses. Look at the Middle East, like Russia, Ukraine, but also undermined and weakened environmental treaties. We just had the COP29. And after decades of compiling scientific evidence that we should halt climate change to 1.5 degrees and stop with fossil fuels, we still fail to put that in firm writing. And the worst of all is that across the world, the increasingly best answer that is given by politicians is not referring to the future, but to the past. And we can see that in the rise of far extreme right all across the world, who are trying to make their countries great again, referring to a glorious past that probably never was as glorious anyways. So the question is, how do we change that? How do we break out this presentism, this interregnum? We really need a paradigm shift. The old must make space for the new. And therefore, this Declaration of Future Generation really aims to shift from the current presentism to strategic foresight. So I will walk you through my presentation firstly to the different forces of change that have in the past and currently do so in the international realm caused profound changes. And then I'll highlight the three parts of the declaration and how they could potentially provoke those forces of change. So in political science, there's the political scientist Robert Cox, and he theorized that there actually are three interacting but also counteracting groups of forces that can change the international realm. And I will, and these are the three groups, but I will illustrate them with the very existence of the United Nations. So the UN arose from the idea to prevent future generations. So this future thinking was already at the beginning of the UN, by the way. And so it was the idea to prevent future generations from the scourge of war after the Second World War. They had the idea that democracy and liberalism, like global trade systems, would set the conditions for peace. But they knew that these ideas in themselves would not be sufficient, so they had to institutionalize them. So they created the Bretton Woods institutions and the entire multilateral system. And these two things together created really change in how our world is organized, how trade is organized, labor, human rights, and so on. Even specifically, because I come from an environmental background, if you think about it, there's such a thing as the Montreal Protocol, which tried to address the hole in the ozone layer. As a result, the hole in the ozone layer actually has been almost completely recovered. So it's the ideas that then are institutionalized that effectively can change our material world. And the cool thing is, once the material world has been changed, it actually reinforces the ideas. But because we can say like, hey, look, we had a longer period of peace because of this democracy and liberalism. And therefore, that gives them, again, more legitimacy to the institutions that we have built around them. So it's kind of a system that keeps itself in the loop. And the interesting thing is, if you think again about the United Nations, none of us in the room was at the decision-making table in 1945. Yet, those decisions have altered our world profoundly. That is the potential of strategic foresight. It's standing in the present and imagining a future and taking actions today to create the future that we want. So now let's evaluate the declaration of future generations against these forces of change. Taking into account, though, that when we speak about future generations, we are actually talking about those generations not born yet. So they do not have a voice at the table. So we need strategic foresight to represent them and think as what would be the legacy that we want to leave behind for them. So the first group of forces of change are the ideational ones. So they explain why we need the declaration of future generations. And this is detailed in the preamble of the declaration. I summarized it in the dot points. You don't have to read them, because the most important part is the quote of Adam Day from the United Nations University. He says, global governance has accountability to the present generations, but impunity to the future ones. And this really captures the dilemma of global governance, because global governance depends on the translation at the national and local level. And these levels of policy making depend on short-term election cycles. So politicians often make decisions that may benefit today in their next elective cycle, but not necessarily benefit the future. And those future generations don't have a voice in that, say, they don't have a vote, so they cannot hold them accountable. And that's why the present generations must speak up for the future ones. Like a good example in the environmental field is obviously climate change. Like, whole the world still has so much subsidized fossil fuels, and they might cause a lower cost of living today, but especially profit for a few companies, but it really sets up future generations for failure. And the same goes for ongoing conflicts and the use of weapons of mass destruction. Maybe they give a gain to one person in power today, but they create decades and generations of destruction. So we need strategic foresight. We really need to be able to think about the impact of our present actions towards the futures. And this matters so much because the decisions that are taken today, so the legacy that we leave behind, determines whether we set future generations up for success or for failure. So there's the Indian economist and philosopher Amartya Sen. And he theorized that all people have the capability to flourish and develop their capacities if only they're given the freedom to do so. And with freedom, we mean the absence of barriers, such as power imbalances, such as environmental degradations, such as inequity, and so on. So today, we really have the power to make the decisions that create or break those barriers. They create the conditions for future generations to flourish or to fail. And that's why the preamble literally recognizes that our actions and inactions have an intergenerational multiplier effect. We do have the responsibility, the ability, and must bear the consequences of our actions. Which is why the preamble reaffirms Agenda 2030, which really defines sustainable development as meeting today's needs without jeopardizing those of the future. Equally, the chart and the declarations on human rights and law are really about setting up those conditions for future generations and current ones to flourish and not to fail. So this is the ideational part. The question is then, how are we going to make that happen? And that's the second part, which are the principles and the commitments. This is how we can institutionalize those changes so they actually become effective. They're again summed up in the slide, please do not read them, but they really emphasize how it's a very holistic approach and they're all aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. And that is really a strength of the declaration. It acknowledges the complexity and the scope of the current challenges. But as I mentioned in the beginning, we had the SDGs for a while. We haven't progressed on them. So if we are just going to reaffirm them, is it really going to be different? So the question that we have to ask is, what difference will the declaration really make? And so what does it propose to do things differently so we get a different outcome? And that's the third part. That are the actions that are defined. So to ensure that decision-making today takes into consideration the needs, well-beings, and right of future generations, the most important proposed action in the declaration is the UN Envoy for Future Generations. This is an institutional framework, and it has been informed by the decade-old example of Wales Well-being of Future Generations Act. So it already exists in the world, and it already has been proven effectively. So what has Wales done? Well, the Act has put a legal obligation on public bodies in Wales to act today for a better tomorrow. So they define 7 interconnected national well-being goals and really hold all governance levels accountable to act upon those goals. So for Wales to go there, they started with a very wide public consultation. They really asked all Welsh peoples, what is the legacy that you want to be behind? How is it that you define well-being? And so that's how they drafted the Act and the 7 well-being goals. What they did next was appointing a Future Generations Commissioner, Sophie Howe. And she really had the power and the possibility to hold all those governance levels accountable. So if somebody would take a decision to set up a certain development project, she would go to these governance levels and ask, okay, how can you prove me that your project is aligned with those 7 interconnected development and well-being goals? If they could not prove that, she could actually hold the project. This was really to, like I said earlier, the future generation does not have a voice, but by putting it in a commissioner, now there's a voice given. And so that's, a good example of Wales, how governance can have accountability to the present and the future generations instead of the current multinational system. And many other countries have actually implemented something similar, like the Oxfordshire Future Generations Champion or the Malta Guardian of Future Generations, and so on. But most remarkably, because this is national level, and you can think, well, multinational is way more complicated, but the European Union even now has announced the inclusion of future generations in their political guidelines as well. And that includes establishing the rights of future generations, integrating foresight into legislative processes, and involving citizens in their long-term decision-making. What's interesting in all these different examples is that they have a few commonalities in how they have institutionalized this idea of strategic foresight. So the first thing they all have in common is a legislative instrument, like the Act of Future Generations of Wales. So we got a legislative instrument, they have policy guidelines, and then a specific institution like a commissioner, an ombudsman, or so on. And mostly it's based on extensive citizen engagement. So this same, the Envoy for Future Generations would be like the commissioner or the ombudsman. It would really be like an institution that can call out other governance levels and ask them, how is what you're doing aligned with strategic foresight? There we go. Oops. So of course these are words, right? So the other actions that we have, that the Future Pact proposes, is to make sure that this is actually happening, right? So they said, or they made a promise that at the General Assembly, the 83rd one, there will be held an inclusive high-level plenary meeting of the General Assembly of Future Generations to review the implementation and provide updates on the actions taken to safeguard the needs and interests of future generations. And this will be based on the report of the Secretary General on the effective implementation. The thing about this General Assembly is, why is it so important, is that they should outline the gap between the policy and the effective progress. And this, again, is a system that actually works, because we're doing that with climate change. Every year, the UN produces the emission gap report that shows, okay, all your countries have made these intended contributions and these pledges, but if you look at the reality of what you're doing, well, this is the gap. And by visualizing that, we can actually hold countries accountable. But this is an important part why I want to link back to the first group of forces of change, like the ideational ones. Because to ensure the effectiveness of these envoy, we need different ways of thinking. And the first one we need is future thinking. And this is important because this is what you can distill actually out of the declaration. If you look into the actions and you read between the lines, you see that there's a really firm referral to future thinking and systems thinking. And futures thinking is really creating accountability and responsibility to future generations by building strategic foresight capacity, but also futures literacy. And the UN already does that, because in 2023, they launched the UN Futures Lab, which is a network that helps countries and organizations all across the world, especially the UN institutions, to build in that strategic foresight into their ways of thinking and operating and decision making. Because the UN Futures Lab wants to enable the world to think systematically and prepare for multiple possible futures. And this lab could really support the environment being more effective. But because we want to prepare for multiple possible futures, right? We want to imagine different things than what we have today. We need systems thinking. And systems thinking requires that we are going to integrate different perspectives by having participatory and inclusive diverse stakeholder engagement. If we only have the same people in the room, we're never going to get like something completely different. So if we bring in many different perspectives, we actually can potentially imagine the world very differently and create different future scenarios. But next to that, we also have to understand the bigger system, the bigger whole of which we are part, and how our actions actually work out in all different ways. And then we can maybe create proactively transformative change instead of reactively incremental patches on what we have. This is, I think, how we could create the new instead of preserving the old that is dying anyways. And that's why the declaration specifically mentions we need the whole of government and a whole of society approach. And this is remarkable, we need to start measuring well-being beyond GDP. It's not about economics only. So, conclusion? To create a different future, we must imagine different futures and break out of the interregnum. And that requires different ideologies. So futures and system thinking, different institutions and involve future generations, and material changes, like actions and decisions that focus on strategic foresight and transformative change rather than patching up the status quo. So can the declaration make that happen? I think so, if only they take into account that these three groups of forces of change interact and reinforce or weaken each other. So that was my presentation. Thank you.